My name is Kanadi Walkingstick, and I am the last ranger of Whispers Creek National Forest. The Cherokee blood that flows through my veins carries 7 generations of forest guardians, each one teaching the next that the woods hold more than trees and wildlife. My grandmother used to say the forest remembers everything, every footstep, every scream, every soul that never found its way home. The morning of September 15th started like any other. I was checking the trail markers near Devil's Backbone Ridge when my radio crackled to life. Kanati, we've got another missing hiker. College student, name's Jessica Chen. Last seen on the Serpent's Path trail yesterday evening. I pressed the talk button, already knowing this wouldn't end well. Copy that, dispatch. Any companions? Negative. Solo hiker. Her car's still at the Whispering Pines trailhead. Solo hiker. The worst kind of search and rescue operation in these parts. Whispers Creek has claimed 17 people in the past 3 years, and only 4 of them were ever found. The lucky ones were discovered within the first 24 hours, usually suffering from exposure and telling impossible stories about shadows that walked upright and yellow eyes that followed them through the trees. The unlucky ones. Well, we found pieces. Never enough to determine what had happened to them. I secured my gear and headed towards Serpent's Path, the most treacherous trail in the forest. The name wasn't just poetic. The path twisted and turned like a snake's back, leading deep into the heart of the wilderness where cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals died. The Cherokee had another name for this place. N.V. Sunzikers translates roughly to, the place where spirits hunt. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It's an occupational hazard for forest rangers. Spend enough time alone in the woods and you develop a sixth sense about being observed. But this felt different, heavier. Like whatever was watching had been doing so for a very long time. The first sign appeared 2 miles in, a tree broken clean in half about 12 feet up. No storm had passed through recently, and the break was too clean, too precise. The Cherokee side of my brain recognized it immediately, a territorial marker. Something big had been here, something that wanted others to know this was its domain. The second sign came at mile marker 3, tracks in the soft earth beside the creek. At first glance they looked human, 5 toes, a heel, an arch. But they were enormous, easily 18 inches long and 6 inches wide. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds. I photographed them with my trail camera, knowing the images would join the others in a file that park management preferred to ignore. Signs 3 through 6 appeared in rapid succession as I pushed deeper into the forest. Massive stones arranged in perfect circles, as if something had been conducting a ceremony. Trees with bark stripped away in precise spirals, 15 feet off the ground. A deer carcass hanging from a branch drained of blood but showing no signs of predation. And most unsettling of all, a pile of human belongings. Hiking boots, a water bottle, a fleece jacket arranged in a neat circle around a fire pit that hadn't been used in weeks. The 7th sign was Jessica Chen herself. I found her at mile marker 5, sitting cross-legged beneath a massive oak tree. She was alive, which should have been the best possible news. Instead, my Cherokee instincts screamed danger. Jessica sat perfectly still, her eyes wide open and completely white, as if the pupils and irises had simply vanished. She was breathing, but slowly, mechanically, like someone in the deepest stages of sleep. Jessica. I approached carefully, my hand instinctively moving to the 45 on my hip. Jessica, can you hear me? She turned her head toward me with unnatural precision, like a mechanical doll. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo that seemed to come from deep underground. He's been waiting for you, Kanadi. The tall one with no face. He remembers your bloodline. My grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind. When the forest speaks through human tongues, do not listen, do not trust, do not follow. Jessica, we need to get you to a hospital. You've been out here for over 18 hours. I activated my emergency beacon, praying it would reach through the canopy. Can you stand? He showed me things, she continued, her white eyes somehow focusing on me despite having no pupils. The place where the missing people go, the feeding ground, the nursery where he keeps the children. What children, Jessica? The ones who got lost playing hide and seek in 1987, the family that disappeared from their campsite in 1994, the Boy Scouts from 2001. Her voice grew softer, more distant. They're all there, Kanadi, all still alive, still waiting for someone to come find them. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the oak tree. Then another. Something massive was moving through the underbrush, circling us with deliberate slowness. I drew my weapon, though I suspected bullets would be useless against whatever was coming. He wants to trade, Jessica whispered. One guardian for all the lost ones, your blood for their freedom. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell into an unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, no wind through the leaves. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. In that impossible quiet, I heard something that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Children laughing and playing, as if from a great distance. "Where are they, Jessica? Where does he keep them?" She smiled, and her white eyes began to weep tears of black sap. "Follow the spiral path, past the boneyard, through the shadow valley, to the place where the earth opens like a mouth." A shadow fell across us, far too large to belong to any tree. I looked up and saw nothing but canopy. Yet the darkness persisted, growing deeper by the second. Jessica's skin began to take on a grayish pallor, and I realized she wasn't breathing anymore. "Jessica!" I knelt beside her, checking for a pulse, but her wrist was cold as stone. According to my watch, she'd been dead for at least 6 hours, yet she'd been speaking to me just moments before. Park management could explain away a lot of things, but they couldn't explain away conversations with corpses. The shadow lifted as suddenly as it had appeared, and the forest sounds returned in a rush. Birds chirped, insects buzzed, and the creek resumed its gentle murmur. Jessica's eyes had returned to their normal brown color, though she remained lifeless. I called in her location and waited for the recovery team, but my mind was already working on the real problem. 17 missing people, and according to a dead woman, they were all still alive somewhere in these woods, waiting for rescue. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the Kekla-Kudla, the giant cannibal who stalked the Cherokee in the old days. She said our ancestors learned to track it by following the spiral of broken trees and arranged stones. She said it could speak through the dead and make bargains with the living. She also said that sometimes a guardian would have to walk into the monster's domain to bring the lost ones home. As I waited for backup, I studied my trail map. There was indeed a spiraling pattern of old-growth trees that led deeper into the wilderness, past a section locals called the Boneyard, where hunters often found unusual animal remains. Beyond that lay a valley that never appeared on any official maps, a place where shadows seemed to pool even on the brightest days. The recovery team arrived just before sunset, and we carried Jessica's body out of the forest, but I knew I'd be coming back. The Cherokee in me demanded it. 17 people were depending on someone to find them, and despite every rational instinct screaming at me to transfer to a nice safe fire tower in Montana, I knew that someone had to be me. That night I sat on my cabin porch and prepared for the hunt. I cleaned my grandfather's rifle, the one he'd carried in Korea, and passed down through 3 generations of Cherokee men. I packed traditional supplies alongside modern gear, cornmeal and tobacco for offerings, sage for cleansing, and a piece of black flint my grandmother had given me before she died. "For when you meet the thing that shouldn't be," she'd said. Cherokee magic still works if you remember how to use it. As I packed, I tried not to think about the fact that none of the previous 17 searchers had ever returned. I tried not to think about Jessica's white eyes and her impossible conversation. I tried not to think about the children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. But mostly, I tried not to think about the thing my grandmother had whispered to me on her deathbed. The Kekla-Kudla isn't just hunting people, Kanati. It's collecting them, building something, and when it has enough. She'd died before finishing the sentence, but I'd always known how it ended. When it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. I set out before dawn, following the spiral pattern I'd mapped the night before. The forest felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, older, more watchful, as if the trees themselves were ancient sentinels keeping track of every intruder. My flashlight beam seemed smaller than usual, swallowed by shadows that moved independently of any breeze. The first mile passed without incident, following a game trail that wound between massive pines. But as I approached the area where the spiral began in earnest, I started noticing things that hadn't been there on my previous patrols. Fresh scratches on tree bark too high to be made by any normal animal, patches of ground where the earth had been disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged through the undergrowth, and hanging from branches at exactly head height, small bundles of bones and feathers tied with sinew, Cherokee warning signs that someone had been marking territory. My radio had died somewhere around mile 2, which should have been impossible given its range. My GPS showed my location as a fuzzy approximation somewhere northwest of nowhere. Even my mechanical compass seemed confused, its needle spinning slowly as if it couldn't quite decide where magnetic north had gone. The boneyard announced itself long before I saw it. The smell hit me first, not the clean scent of naturally decomposed remains, but something fouler, more organic, like a slaughterhouse that had been left to rot in the summer heat. I tied a bandana around my nose and mouth, more for psychological comfort than any real protection. The clearing opened up suddenly, a perfect circle maybe 50 yards across. The ground was carpeted with bones, not just animal bones but things I couldn't immediately identify. Femurs that were too long, skulls with too many teeth, rib cages that seemed designed for creatures that had never walked the earth. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches forming an almost perfect canopy overhead. That's where I found the first real evidence of human presence. Carved into the oak's bark about 7 feet up, were symbols I recognized from my grandmother's teachings. Cherokee syllabary mixed with older markings, symbols that predated any written language. The carvings were fresh, the sap still bleeding from the cuts. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew the old ways. I photographed the symbols, then took out the piece of black flint my grandmother had given me. Cherokee tradition held that flint could cut through spiritual deceptions, revealing truth where lies had been planted. I scraped a small piece of bark away from beneath the symbols, and was startled to see what looked like names carved underneath. Michael Torres, 2019. Sarah Kim, 2020. The Hendricks family, 2021. All missing persons from my files. A branch snapped behind me, and I spun around to see a figure standing at the edge of the boneyard. For a moment, my heart leaped. Another survivor, someone else who'd found their way to this place. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the figure wasn't quite right. Too tall, maybe 7.5 feet. Too thin, as if someone had stretched a normal person like Taffy. And where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin, blank as a mannequin. The creature, I couldn't think of it as human anymore, tilted its head to one side with a motion that reminded me of a curious dog. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from somewhere inside my own head. "The Guardian arrives. Good. We have been waiting. Where are they?" I kept my rifle trained on the center of its mass, though I doubted conventional weapons would have much effect. "Where are the missing people?" "Safe, fed, cared for. They sleep now in the deep places, dreaming dreams we give them. I want to see them." The faceless thing gestured toward the far side of the clearing, where I now noticed a path leading downward between two massive boulders. The shadows between the stones seemed darker than they should have been, as if light simply couldn't penetrate whatever lay beyond. "Come then, Guardian. See what becomes of the lost." "Not until you explain the deal. Jessica said you wanted to trade." "Jessica speaks still. Interesting. Death sits lightly on some spirits." The creature moved closer, and I caught a scent like wet earth and copper pennies. "Yes, a trade. One life freely given for 17 lives freely returned. The Guardian's blood for the freedom of the collected." "Why me specifically? Why not any of the other searchers?" "Because you carry the old blood. Cherokee magic. The spiral path recognizes you, calls to you. Your ancestors knew us, hunted us, drove us into the deep places, but you came looking." I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the warriors who had ventured into the creature's domain to rescue captives. Most of them never returned. The few who did were changed forever, marked by whatever they'd seen in the darkness below. "Show me they're alive first, then we'll talk about trades." The creature nodded, a disturbingly human gesture from something that clearly wasn't, and began walking toward the shadowed path. I followed, keeping my rifle ready, and trying to ignore the way the bones crunched under my boots. The path descended more steeply than seemed possible, as if we were walking into the earth itself rather than down a hillside. The walls on either side were smooth stone, too smooth to be natural, carved with more of the symbols I'd seen on the oak tree. Emergency LED lights would have been useless here. The darkness seemed to absorb illumination, making my flashlight beam barely visible beyond a few feet. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the path opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling disappeared into blackness overhead, and the space was filled with what looked like enormous spider webs, except the strands were too thick, too organic. Caught in the webs, suspended 10 or 15 feet off the ground, were cocoons. Human-shaped cocoons. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "He hears little in these depths." The creature replied, "But they dream beautiful dreams. Watch." One of the cocoons nearest to us began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. Through the translucent membrane I could see a human form, a young man, maybe early 20s. His eyes were closed, but his lips were moving as if he were having a conversation with someone. As I watched, he smiled and laughed silently. "Michael Torres," I said, recognizing him from a missing person photo. "He dreams he is home with his family, celebrating his birthday. They have made him a cake, sung him songs. He is happy, while you slowly digest him, while we keep him safe, fed, preserved. There are worse fates than comfortable dreams." I counted the cocoons, 17, just as Jessica had said. Men, women, children, all suspended in that terrible web, all lost in whatever artificial paradise the creature had created for them. "The trade," I said. "Explain it. You take their place. Your dreams will be different, darker, but they will be returned to the surface, unharmed, believing they were lost for only a day or two. Your sacrifice saves them. And if I refuse, they remain. Eventually they will become like us, guardians of the deep places, collectors of the lost. It is not so terrible a fate." I thought about the families waiting for these people to come home, parents who hadn't slept in years, wondering what had happened to their children, spouses checking their phones every few minutes, hoping for word, children asking when daddy was coming back. Then I thought about my grandmother's final words about the creature building something, collecting people for some larger purpose. What are you really doing here? What's the end game? The faceless creature was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its mental voice carried what might have been sadness. We are the final remnants of something your people helped to destroy. We do not reproduce as you do. We do not age as you do. We simply persist. But persistence requires sustenance, and sustenance requires dreams. You're feeding off their minds. We are preserving them. When the surface world destroys itself, as all worlds eventually do, these dreams will remain. Perfect moments, trapped forever in amber. They will be all that survives of your species. I raised my rifle. Let them go. You would doom them to return to your world of violence and cruelty and eventual death. This is mercy, Guardian. Their choice to make, not yours. The creature moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was directly in front of me. Its smooth face inches from mine. I felt something probing at the edges of my consciousness, trying to slip inside my thoughts. Sleep, Guardian. Dream of better things. But Cherokee magic runs deeper than most people realize, and my grandmother had taught me more than just stories. I pressed the piece of black flint against the creature's chest and spoke the words she'd made me memorize. Ustai, Enve Hai, Jiviali, El Vetsunsdai, Nenve Hai, El Aduyuktuvvi. Little spirit, I command you to leave. Spirit and human are separate. The creature recoiled as if I'd hit it with live electricity. The mental pressure disappeared, and for a moment its smooth face rippled like water, revealing something underneath that I really didn't want to see clearly. Old magic, it hissed. Older than we expected. Let them go, or I'll use more than words. But the creature was already backing away, melting into the shadows between the web strands. Its voice echoed from all around the chamber now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The trade remains open, Guardian. Return when you understand that mercy sometimes wears the face of imprisonment. The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones falling from the invisible ceiling. The webs holding the cocoons started to sway alarmingly, and I realized the creature was bringing the whole place down around us. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice. Run for the surface and leave 17 people to their eternal dreams, or try to cut them down and carry them out before the chamber collapsed. My grandmother always said that being Cherokee meant making the hard choices, even when they were impossible. I started climbing toward the nearest cocoon, my knife in one hand and my emergency rope in the other. The creature's laughter followed me up into the web, cold and ancient and completely without humor. 17 lives, Guardian. Can you save them all before the mountain falls? I reached Michael Torres first and started cutting through the membrane of his cocoon. The material was tougher than it looked, more like cartilage than spider silk. As my knife finally penetrated, viscous fluid began pouring out, and Michael's eyes snapped open. He looked directly at me and said, "Tell my mom the birthday cake was perfect." Then he started screaming. Michael Torres screamed for exactly 17 seconds before falling unconscious. I managed to lower him to the chamber floor using my emergency rope, but the delay cost me precious time. The ceiling continued to rain debris, and larger chunks of stone were beginning to fall. I had 16 more people to save, and maybe 10 minutes before the whole place caved in. The Cherokee in me said to cut my losses, grab Michael, and run for the surface. The Ranger in me said 17 people had families who deserved to have them home. And the part of me that remembered my grandmother's stories said that sometimes the only way to win against a Kekla Kudla was to do something so crazy it didn't expect it. I started cutting down cocoons as fast as I could, letting them fall to the chamber floor with wet, sickening thuds. Some of the people inside were still dreaming. I could see their eyes moving beneath closed lids, their faces peaceful and content. Others, like Michael, snapped awake the moment their cocoons ruptured, their expressions shifting from bliss to absolute terror in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah Kim, the graduate student who disappeared while researching local folklore. She woke up swinging, trying to fight off invisible attackers until I managed to calm her down enough to explain where we were. The Hendricks family. Mother, father, 2 children aged 8 and 12. They woke up together, holding hands even as their dream fluid drained away. And I realized the creature had been letting them share their dreams. For 3 years they'd been living in a fantasy version of their interrupted camping trip where nothing bad ever happened, and they could stay together forever. By the time I'd cut down 12 of the 17, my arms felt like lead, and the chamber was shaking so violently I could barely stand. The faceless creature's voice echoed from the darkness above, no longer angry but almost sad. You saved them to return to what? Divorce papers? Cancer diagnoses? Car accidents? Economic collapse? The dreams we gave them were better than anything your world offers. That's not your choice to make, I shouted back, sawing through another cocoon membrane. This one contained a Boy Scout from the 2001 disappearance, now a man in his 30s, but preserved exactly as he'd been at age 12. Look at them, Guardian. Look at what you are dragging them back to. I looked. Some of the rescued people were catatonic, staring at nothing with expressions of devastating loss. Others were sobbing uncontrollably as if they'd just learned of the death of everyone they'd ever loved. Michael Torres was curled in a fetal position, whispering, "It's not real, it's not real," over and over again. "They'll heal," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Will they? Or will they spend the rest of their lives trying to return to the dreams you stole from them?" I cut down the 15th person, a middle-aged hiker, who disappeared 6 months ago. She woke up screaming my name, which was impossible since we'd never met, but then she grabbed my arm with desperate strength. "You have to stop cutting them down," she gasped. "It's not what you think. We're not prisoners, we're guards. We're keeping something else locked up." "What?" But the chamber chose that moment to really start collapsing. A chunk of ceiling the size of a pickup truck crashed down, missing me by inches. The woman was crushed instantly, her final words lost in the roar of falling stone. 2 more cocoons. I could see them hanging just out of reach, swaying in the chaos. The smart thing would have been to gather up the 15 survivors and get them to safety. But I'd come this far, and Cherokee's stubbornness runs deep. I started climbing again, using the web strands like rope, trying to reach the last 2 people before everything came down. As I climbed, I realized the woman had been right about one thing. The chamber wasn't just collapsing, it was opening. The falling debris was revealing other passages, other chambers, all of them filled with a blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. And from those passages came sounds. Not the creature's voice, but something else. Something that had been locked away for a very long time and was now stirring. I reached the 16th cocoon and started cutting, but my knife was getting dull and the membrane was thicker here, older. Through the translucent wall I could see an elderly man, maybe 70 years old, but according to my files he disappeared as a 25-year-old hiker in 1995. The creature had been keeping him in dreams for nearly 30 years. As his cocoon ruptured, he opened eyes that held 3 decades of accumulated wisdom and terror. "Boy," he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves, "you've doomed us all." The blue light from the other chambers was getting brighter, and the sounds were getting louder. Not quite human, not quite animal, but definitely alive and definitely angry about being awakened. "What is it?" I shouted over the noise of the collapse. "The reason the Kekla Kudla exists," he said. "The reason it collects dreams. It's not feeding on us, it's using our dreams to keep the barrier strong, to keep the NVI Duyuk TV sleeping." NVHI Duyuk TV. The spirit demons from the deepest Cherokee legends. The things that existed before the world was made, trapped beneath the earth by the first medicine men and women. My grandmother had told me stories, but I'd always thought they were metaphors. The 17th cocoon was just above me, but it was different from the others, larger, older, and pulsing with its own internal light. As I reached for it, the elderly man grabbed my ankle. "Don't, that one's not human anymore. That one's become something else." But it was too late. My knife had already pierced the membrane, and what poured out wasn't fluid but pure light. Blinding, searing, impossible light that burned away shadows and revealed things that should have stayed hidden. The thing that had been in the 17th cocoon unfurled like a flower made of starfire and screaming wind. It had been human once. I could see the remnants of a human form at its core, but decades of dreams and spirit energy had transformed it into something between guardian and god. "Finally," it said, and its voice was the sound of mountains being born. "Finally, the seals are broken." The blue light from the other chambers erupted outward, and I saw what we'd really accomplished. The Kekla Kudla hadn't been torturing people. It had been using their dreams as fuel to maintain a prison, and I'd just set all the prisoners free. The faceless creature materialized beside me, no longer threatening but almost pleading. "Do you understand now, Guardian? Do you see why we needed them?" Around us, the mountain was splitting open like an overripe fruit. Things that had been locked away since the Cherokee first learned to speak were clawing their way to the surface, eager to reclaim a world they'd been banished from eons ago. "How do we fix this?" I asked. "We cannot. But you can contain them, for a while. Your blood freely given, your dreams willingly shared, become what they were, and perhaps the barriers can be rebuilt." I looked down at the 15 people I'd rescued. They were huddled together, staring up at the chaos above them with expressions of dawning horror. They understood now what they'd lost, what they'd been protecting the world from simply by sleeping. The transformed human thing drifted closer, its voice like singing crystal. "Join us, Cherokee Guardian. Join us in the deep places and help us hold back the dark." I thought about my grandmother's stories about the warriors who went into the monster's cave and never came back. I'd always wondered if they'd died or just found something more important than coming home. Now I knew. "Get them out," I told the Kekla Kudla. All 15. Get them to the surface. Make them forget the worst of this. Let them think they were just lost in the woods for a few days. And you. I pulled out my knife and drew it across my palm, letting Cherokee blood drip onto the chamber floor. The stone hissed where it landed, and the cracks spreading through the ceiling began to slow. And I stay. Someone has to guard the guards. The faceless creature nodded, something like respect in its posture. It will not be pleasant dreams, Guardian. Cherokee warriors don't dream of pleasant things. As the creature began herding the survivors toward the surface, I felt the change beginning. My blood was soaking into the stone and the stone was soaking into me. I could feel my consciousness expanding, touching the prison walls that held back things older than civilization. The last thing I saw before the transformation completed was Michael Torres looking back at me from the tunnel entrance. He raised his hand in a small salute, and I realized he understood. They all understood, now. They'd carry the memory of what they'd lost, but they'd also carry the knowledge of why it had been necessary. The mountain sealed itself around me, and I felt my human thoughts beginning to scatter like leaves in an autumn wind. But at the core of my being, the part that would persist through eternity, I held on to one simple truth. Sometimes being a guardian means becoming the thing you're guarding against. Sometimes the monster is the hero of the story. And sometimes the only way to save the world is to disappear into the darkness and make sure the really dangerous things stay asleep. In the depths beneath Whispers Creek National Forest, I joined my voice to the ancient song that keeps the Envuri Duyukadiv dreaming. Every day new hikers disappear into these woods. Every day new dreamers are needed to maintain the barriers. And every day I remember my grandmother's final words. When it has enough, it won't need to hide in the forest anymore. We never have enough. We never will. But we keep trying. Because that's what guardians do. My name is Matthew Carson, and I've been a park ranger at Shasta Trinity National Forest for 12 years. What I'm about to tell you isn't some campfire story or urban legend. These are events I witnessed firsthand, documented in official reports that were later classified or mysteriously lost. I'm breaking my silence because people deserve to know what lurks in America's wilderness. It started during my 3rd year on the job. I was stationed at the remote Granite Peak Outpost, a solitary cabin 20 miles from the nearest road. My partner Ezra Williams had just transferred in from Yellowstone. He was a seasoned ranger, 15 years my senior, with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much. You ever hear strange things out here at night? Ezra asked during our first patrol together. It was late September, and the autumn air carried a bite that seemed to penetrate straight to the bone. Animal calls sometimes, I replied, checking my radio. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to a series of deep gouges in a massive Douglas fir. The marks were at least 9 feet up the trunk, far too high for any bear. Each claw mark was nearly 2 inches deep, and spaced wider than any known predator's paw. Found these yesterday, he said quietly. Similar marks on 5 other trees in a perfect circle, like something was marking territory. I examined the gouges more closely. The bark was shredded and sap still oozed from the fresher wounds. What disturbed me most was the pattern, deliberate, almost intelligent. That night, the howling started. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. The sound began low, almost subsonic, vibrating through the cabin walls. Then it rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache, holding notes that no animal throat should produce. Ezra sat bolt upright in his bunk, hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. "That's no wolf," he whispered. The howling continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough to rattle our windows, other times echoing from miles away. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we found tracks. They started at the tree line, circled our cabin 3 times, then vanished near the creek. Each print was massive, nearly 14 inches long and 7 inches wide. But what made my blood run cold was their shape, distinctly canine in the heel and pad, but with elongated toes that ended in what looked like human-like digits. "Dogman," Ezra said, his voice barely audible. "Heard about sightings up in Michigan, but never this far west." I wanted to laugh it off, dismiss it as a hoax or misidentification, but the evidence was right there, pressed deep into the soft earth. Whatever made these tracks weighed at least 300 pounds and walked on 2 legs. The stride length proved that. We reported the findings to headquarters. The response was swift and unusual. Within hours, a team arrived, not Park Service but men in unmarked vehicles who flashed federal badges and told us to forget what we'd seen. They took photos, made casts of the prints, and left without explanation. Gabriel Martinez, our district supervisor, pulled us aside afterward. "You boys are being reassigned, effective immediately." "Why?" I demanded. "We've done nothing wrong." Gabriel's expression was grim. "It's for your own safety. There are things in these woods that, well, some stones are better left unturned. But I couldn't let it go. Over the following weeks, I researched everything I could about cryptid sightings in Northern California. What I found chilled me. Dozens of missing persons cases, all hikers or hunters who vanished without a trace. Witness reports of massive bipedal canines, Native American legends warning of shapeshifters that hunted human prey. One name kept appearing in my research, Carter Blackwood, a retired ranger who'd worked these same forests in the 1980s. I tracked him down to a small cabin outside Mount Shasta. When I mentioned the dogman, his weathered face went pale. "Sit down, son," he said, pouring himself a generous glass of whiskey. "If you've seen it, you need to understand what you're dealing with." Carter told me about the winter of '87. 3 hikers had gone missing on the Pacific Crest Trail. Search and rescue found their camp destroyed, tents shredded by massive claws, blood everywhere but no bodies. Carter was part of the tracking team that followed the trail. "We found them 2 miles north," he said, his hand trembling slightly. "What was left of them anyway? Bodies torn apart, bones cracked open for marrow. But the worst part was the bite marks. Canine teeth in front, molars in back, like something caught between wolf and man." He showed me photos he'd kept hidden for decades. Even in black and white, the carnage was horrific. But one image stood out, a clear photograph of a massive, hair-covered figure standing at the edge of the forest. It stood upright, at least 7 feet tall, with the head of a wolf and the body of a man. "Forest Service buried it all," Carter continued. "Threatened our jobs, our pensions, everything if we talked. But I kept copies. Someone needs to know the truth." I returned to my new station at a more populated campground, but the encounters didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. Reports flooded in from hikers, strange howls, glimpses of massive figures moving through the trees, pets vanishing from campsites. Then came the night that changed everything. October 31st, Halloween. I was working the late shift with my new partner, Isaac Torres. Around midnight, we received a frantic radio call from a family camping near Eagle Lake. The father, Anthony Chen, was nearly hysterical. "Something's circling our tent, it's huge. Oh God, it's trying to get in." We raced to their campsite, arriving in under 10 minutes. The scene was chaos. The family's tent was destroyed, massive claw marks rendering the fabric to ribbons. Anthony stood protectively over his wife and 2 children, wielding a camp hatchet with shaking hands. "Where did it go?" I asked, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. "That way," he pointed toward the dense undergrowth. It was enormous, walked on 2 legs like a man, but had the head of a dog or wolf. When our flashlight hit its eyes, they glowed yellow. Isaac called for backup while I examined the scene. The tracks were identical to what Ezra and I had found weeks earlier. But this time there was something else. Tufts of coarse dark fur caught on the tent's remains. I carefully collected samples, ignoring protocol. The family was evacuated, and the campsite was sealed off. By morning, the same unmarked vehicles arrived. The same men in suits who took everything and left us with stern warnings about confidentiality. But I'd hidden some of the fur samples. A friend at UC Davis ran DNA tests off the books. The results were impossible. The samples contained genetic markers from both Canis lupus, gray wolf, and Homo sapiens, human. "This can't be right," my friend said. "No hybrid like this could exist. It violates everything we know about genetics." Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something that shouldn't exist was hunting in our forests. And based on the pattern of sightings, it was becoming bolder. The first human death occurred 3 weeks later. Dylan Rodriguez was an experienced outdoorsman, the kind who could survive a week in the wilderness with nothing but a knife and his wits. When his remains were found in early December, the official report blamed a bear attack. But I saw the body. No bear did that. Dylan had been partially consumed, his flesh stripped from bones with almost surgical precision. The bite patterns were human-like, but the tooth marks suggested a jaw that could unhinge far wider than any person's. Most disturbing were the signs of systematic feeding. Whoever or whatever killed Dylan had taken their time, savoring the meal over several days. I was partnered with Lincoln Hayes for the investigation. Link, as everyone called him, was a former Marine with nerves of steel. Even he was shaken by what we found at Dylan's final campsite. "Look at this," Link said, pointing to strange symbols carved into the surrounding trees. They were crude but deliberate, twisted figures that seemed to writhe even in their static form. "Ever seen anything like these?" I had in my research into Native American folklore. The symbols resembled warnings used by the Ojibwe people to mark areas cursed by the Wendigo, a cannibalistic creature born from humans who resorted to eating flesh during desperate winters. Thomas Whitehorse, an elder from the local Shasta tribe, confirmed my suspicions when I showed him photos of the symbols. Your friend stumbled into forbidden territory, Thomas said gravely. These mountains have dark histories. During the harsh winter of 1846, settlers trapped by snow turned to unspeakable acts. Some say their spirits never left, transformed by their sins into something neither human nor beast. He told me about the Wendigo, creatures of insatiable hunger, forever cursed to crave human flesh. Unlike the Dogman, which seemed to be a physical creature, the Wendigo existed partially in the spirit realm, able to possess the desperate or weak-willed. The hunger is like a disease, Thomas explained. It spreads from one victim to the next. Those who taste human flesh, even in desperation, risk becoming Wendigo themselves. Link and I expanded our investigation, discovering a pattern of disappearances dating back decades. Every severe winter, when snow isolated the high country, people vanished. Some were found partially eaten, others were never found at all. Maverick Jones, a search and rescue volunteer, shared his own encounter from the previous winter. He'd been tracking a lost skier near Castle Lake when he found something that defied explanation. There were human footprints in the snow, Maverick told us, but as I followed them they changed, got longer, more distorted. The stride lengthened until whatever was walking must have been 12 feet tall. Then the tracks just ended, like it had taken flight. He showed us photos from his phone. The transformation in the tracks was undeniable, human feet gradually morphing into something monstrous. At the end of the trail, deep gouges in a tree trunk suggested something had climbed straight up, leaving claw marks no human could make. The situation escalated when a family of 4 went missing just before Christmas. The Brennans' parents Elias and Josiah with their teenage sons Charles and Caleb, had been camping in a remote area despite winter weather warnings. Their abandoned vehicle was found at a trailhead covered in a foot of fresh snow. Link and I joined the search team, along with Christopher Walsh and Ezekiel Stone from neighboring districts. As we penetrated deeper into the frozen wilderness, an oppressive atmosphere settled over us. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no small animals, even the wind seemed muted. We found the Brennans' camp on the second day. The tent stood intact but empty, sleeping bags still arranged inside. No signs of struggle, no blood. They had simply vanished. But the surrounding trees bore those same twisted symbols, carved fresh and deep. They were warned, Ezekiel muttered, examining the carvings. Whatever did this wanted them to know they were trespassing. As night fell, we made camp nearby, hoping to find clues in the morning. That's when we heard it, a sound that will haunt me forever. It started as wind through the trees, but gradually formed into words, spoken in a voice that was almost but not quite human. So hungry, so cold. The voice circled our camp, sometimes whispering, sometimes roaring. Our breath misted in air that suddenly dropped 20 degrees. Frost formed on our tents even though the weather had been mild. Christopher was the first to see it. There, he shouted, pointing his flashlight at a figure standing between 2 pines. It had once been human. That much was clear from the tattered remains of clothing hanging from its emaciated frame. But the transformation was horrific. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its skin was gray-white like old ash, stretched tight over bones that jutted at impossible angles. The face was the worst part, human features distorted by an impossibly wide mouth filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The thing smiled at us, black drool dripping from its maw. When it spoke, its voice was multiple voices. Man, woman, and children speaking in horrible unison. Join us, so hungry. Feast awaits. Link raised his rifle, but the creature moved with inhuman speed, vanishing into the darkness before he could fire. We spent the night back to back, weapons ready, as whispers and laughter echoed from the forest around us. Sometimes we glimpsed pale figures moving between the trees, not one, but several. At first light, we found new tracks leading away from our camp. Human footprints that gradually transformed into something else. We followed them to a cave system hidden behind a frozen waterfall. The smell emanating from within was indescribable. Decay, old meat, and something else that triggered a primal revulsion. Inside, we found the Brennans. What was left of them had been carefully arranged in a grotesque tableau, their remains positioned as if sitting down to a family dinner. The worst part was realizing that some of the bite marks were self-inflicted. They had been compelled to consume themselves and each other. On the cave walls, written in blood, was a message. The hunger spreads. Winter feeds. Join the feast. Join the feast. We retreated, calling in every authority we could. But when the response team arrived, the cave was empty. No bodies, no blood. Even our footprints in the snow had been erased. Only the symbols on the trees remained. The official report blamed the Brennans' disappearance on an avalanche. The cave was sealed with explosives, the area marked as dangerously unstable. But Link and I knew the truth. The Wendigo had claimed them. adding their tormented spirits to its collective hunger. 3 more families vanished that winter. Each time the pattern was the same. Abandoned camps, twisted symbols, and whispers in the night of endless hunger. Search teams reported equipment failures, compasses spinning wildly, and GPS units showing locations that didn't match reality. Miles Donovan, a seasoned tracker, quit after his partner Joshua vanished during a search. "1 minute Josh was right behind me," Miles said, visibly shaken. "I turned around and found only his boots standing in the snow like he'd been lifted straight out of them. Then I heard his voice from above, laughing in the trees, inviting me to dinner." By February, the Park Service had quietly closed large sections of the forest. The public was told it was due to severe weather and avalanche risk. In reality, we had lost control. Whatever darkness had awakened was spreading, and we were powerless to stop it. Spring brought a brief respite from the Wendigo encounters, but it also revealed new terrors. As the snow melted, Jackson Mitchell, a trail maintenance worker, made a discovery that would shake our understanding of what inhabited these woods. "You need to see this," Jackson radioed in, his voice oddly subdued. "Grid reference 41-7. And bring the biggest tape measure you can find." Isaiah Cooper and I responded to his call. What we found defied rational explanation. Pressed deep into the muddy earth was a footprint, humanoid in shape but impossibly large. The print measured 22 inches long and 9 inches wide, with 5 clearly defined toes. The depth suggested something weighing at least 800 pounds. "There's more," Jackson said, leading us along what appeared to be a trail. Every 8 to 10 feet, another massive print appeared. The stride length indicated something well over 9 feet tall. We followed the tracks for nearly a mile before they vanished at a creek. On the opposite bank, broken branches 15 feet up showed where something had pushed through. Whatever made these prints wasn't trying to hide. It had walked openly through the forest like it owned it. Andrew Park, our wildlife biologist, analyzed the casts we made. His conclusion was disturbing. The anatomy is essentially human, just scaled up dramatically. But the bone density required to support such mass, it shouldn't be possible. Reports of giant humanoid creatures in these forests went back generations. The local tribes spoke of the Sabe, the forest giants who lived in harmony with nature until loggers and settlers drove them deep into the wilderness. Unlike the malevolent Dogman or Wendigo, these beings were said to be peaceful unless provoked. That changed on a warm May evening. A group of college students camping near Mount Eddy reported that their campsite was invaded by a monster. When Nathan Cross and I arrived, we found their camp destroyed, not torn apart like the Dogman attacks, but systematically dismantled. Tents had been pulled up and folded. Backpacks were opened and their contents sorted into piles. Food was missing, but everything else was arranged almost thoughtfully. "It was huge," stammered Nolan Wright, one of the students, at least 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, but its eyes, they were intelligent. It looked at us like it was studying us. The creature hadn't hurt anyone. When the students screamed, it had simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with surprising grace for something so large. But what struck me was Nolan's description of its face, almost human, with a heavy brow and flattened nose, but undeniably aware. Adrian Silva, a photographer who'd spent years trying to document Bigfoot, contacted me after hearing about the incident. He showed me hundreds of photos taken with motion-activated cameras throughout the forest. "Look at these," he said, spreading out prints showing broken branches, disturbed vegetation, and shadowy figures at the edge of clarity. "I've been tracking movement patterns for 5 years. There's a population of at least a dozen in this area alone." One photo stood out. Taken just a month earlier, it showed a massive figure silhouetted against the sunset. The proportions were human-like but impossibly large. In its hand, it carried what appeared to be a crude spear. "They're not animals," Adrian insisted. "They make tools, have territories, possibly even a language. I've recorded vocalizations that seem to be communication." He played audio files of deep resonant calls that echoed through the forest. Some were simple whoops and howls, but others had a complexity that suggested meaning beyond basic animal sounds. In one recording, 2 distinct voices seemed to be exchanging information in a pattern too structured to be random. Our understanding shifted from viewing Bigfoot as a cryptid to recognizing it as another form of intelligent life sharing our forests. But this revelation came with complications. Cameron Torres, a logger working in a restricted area, had an encounter that turned violent. He'd been marking trees for cutting when something massive struck him from behind, sending him flying 20 feet. When he looked up, a creature towering over 9 feet tall stood between him and his equipment. "It didn't want me there," Cameron told me from his hospital bed, nursing 3 broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder. "It pointed at me, then at my truck, then made a gesture I understood clear as day, 'Get out.' When Cameron tried to retrieve his chainsaw, the creature picked it up and bent it in half with its bare hands, tossing the ruined tool at his feet. The message was clear: stay out of its territory. More concerning were reports from Santiago Reyes and Eli Harper, both experienced hunters who'd witnessed what they described as Bigfoot hunting parties. Multiple creatures working together, using coordination and strategy to drive deer into ambushes. They're not just surviving out there, Santiago said. They're thriving, and they're getting bolder. The tipping point came in late June. Aaron Williams, age 8, vanished from a family picnic area in broad daylight. Witnesses reported seeing a large, hair-covered figure watching the group from the tree line throughout the day. When Aaron wandered slightly away from the group to chase a butterfly, he simply disappeared. The search was massive. Ryan Miller led a team of 24 rangers and volunteers, scouring every inch of forest. Cooper Anderson brought in tracking dogs, but they refused to follow the scent trail, whimpering and cowering when directed towards certain areas. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. Waylon Price, searching alone despite protocol, found Aaron. The boy was unharmed, sitting in a cave 5 miles from where he'd vanished. He was clean, well-fed, and oddly calm. "The hairy giant took care of me," Aaron told us. "She gave me berries and water. She sang to me when I was scared." Aaron described a female Bigfoot who had apparently rescued him from a steep ravine he'd fallen into. She'd carried him to safety and watched over him, even bringing him cooked meat and showing him edible plants. When she heard the search parties approaching, she'd left him where he'd be found. The cave showed evidence of habitation: beds of dried grass, stored food, even crude paintings on the walls depicting forest scenes. It was a home, not just a shelter. This incident forced us to reconsider our approach. These weren't monsters to be feared or animals to be captured. They were intelligent beings with their own culture and apparent compassion. But they were also becoming more territorial as human encroachment increased. Easton Clark, a wilderness guide, proposed a radical solution: designated no-go zones where the Bigfoot could live undisturbed. The Park Service publicly scoffed at the idea, but privately, certain areas were quietly marked as off-limits for environmental restoration. By autumn, the forest had become a battlefield between forces we barely understood. The Dogman grew bolder, attacking closer to populated areas. The Wendigo incidents increased as the weather cooled, and the Bigfoot population seemed to be migrating, their movements suggesting they were fleeing something. Kai Morrison and Christian Davis were conducting a wildlife survey when they witnessed something that connected all three phenomena. Hidden in a blind, they observed a confrontation that challenged everything we thought we knew. A Bigfoot family group was foraging in a meadow, Kai reported. 2 adults and what looked like a juvenile. Then this thing came out of the forest. The creature Kai described matched our Dogman reports: 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with the head of a wolf and the body of a man. But instead of attacking, it approached the Bigfoot group, making submissive gestures. They communicated, Christian added. Not in words, but in growls, gestures, body language. The Bigfoot seemed to be warning the Dogman about something. Then they all looked north and scattered like something terrifying was coming. Minutes later, the temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the meadow in seconds. The Wendigo emerged from the tree line, not 1 but 3 of them moving with jerky, unnatural gaits. They searched the area where the creatures had been, their frustration evident in human shrieks that echoed across the valley. This wasn't random coincidence. The various entities in our forest were aware of each other, possibly even organizing. But why? What was driving this unprecedented behavior? Landon Foster, an anthropologist studying Native American folklore, offered a theory. In tribal legends, these beings have always existed in balance. The Sadi as protectors, the Dogman as hunters, the Wendigo as a cautionary force. But something has disrupted that balance. He pointed to increased logging, mining exploration, and tourist development. Human activity wasn't just encroaching on habitat, it was disturbing something fundamental about these forests. Colton Vance, working the night shift at a remote ranger station, experienced this disruption firsthand. He radioed in a panic just after midnight, reporting his station was under siege. Roman Torres and I responded, finding the station's windows shattered and deep claw marks covering the walls. Colton was barricaded in the equipment room, clutching a shotgun with shaking hands. They were fighting each other, he gasped. The Dogman and one of those gray things, the Wendigo. They tore into each other right outside my window. The sounds, God, the sounds they made. Blood covered the ground outside. Some red, some black, and tar-like. Tufts of fur and chunks of gray flesh littered the area. Whatever conflict was brewing had erupted into open violence. Hunter Chen, analyzing the blood samples, made a shocking discovery. The Wendigo tissue showed signs of infection, not bacterial or viral, but something that seemed to be rewriting its cellular structure. "It's breaking down," Hunter explained. "Whatever supernatural force animates these things, it's failing. They're dying, and they're desperate." This explained the increased aggression. The Wendigo weren't just hunting. They were trying to reproduce, to spread their curse before they were wiped out entirely. And they saw the other forest entities as either threats or potential hosts. Jonathan Ruiz witnessed the full horror of this desperation. While checking trail cameras, he discovered footage of a Wendigo attack on a Bigfoot. The massive creature fought valiantly, its strength incredible, but the Wendigo, its unnatural abilities, phasing in and out of visibility, impossibly fast movements, and numbing cold, eventually overwhelmed it. The worst part was what happened after, Jonathan said, visibly shaken. The Wendigo didn't just kill it, it converted it. The Bigfoot rose up, its eyes now black, frost covering its fur. It had become some kind of hybrid. These Wendigo-possessed Bigfoot were abominations, combining the physical power of the forest giants with the supernatural hunger of the cursed spirits. They were nearly unstoppable, and their numbers were growing. Connor Black organized armed patrols, but conventional weapons proved marginally effective. Bullets slowed them down but didn't stop them. Fire seemed to work better, but starting forest fires brought its own risks. Micah Stevens, studying Native American remedies, discovered references to sacred rituals that could combat the Wendigo. Working with tribal elders, he learned about specific herbs and ceremonies that might weaken the creature's hold on our reality. The Wendigo exist partially in the spirit world, Micah explained. Physical attacks alone won't stop them. We need to sever their connection to this plane. Jeremiah Wright led the first attempt at a spiritual cleansing. Armed with sage, sacred tobacco, and artifacts blessed by tribal shamans, a team entered one of the most active areas. What they found changed everything. In a hidden valley deep in the wilderness, we discovered the source of the escalation. Ezekiel Stone, mapping cave systems, had found an abandoned military installation from the 1950s. Classified documents left behind revealed Project Cryptid, government experiments attempting to weaponize supernatural entities. They were trying to create super soldiers, Ezekiel said, showing us files detailing genetic experiments, attempts at summoning and binding forest spirits, and worse. They captured specimens, tried to replicate their abilities, but something went wrong. The facility had been abandoned in a hurry. Cages were torn open from the inside. Dark stains covered laboratory floors, and in the deepest level we found the horror that had been unleashed. A massive containment chamber had been breached. Inside, occult symbols mixed with scientific equipment suggested an attempt to artificially create a Wendigo, to harness its power without the need for cannibalism or curses. They had partially succeeded. Adam Chen, our hazmat specialist, detected residual energy that was still active. Whatever they summoned or created, it's been leaking into the environment for decades. It's corrupting the natural order. This explained everything. The increasing aggression, the territorial disputes, the Wendigo infection spreading to other creatures. It all stemmed from this unnatural source, poisoning the spiritual ecosystem of the forest. Aidan Murphy coordinated our response, working with tribal elders, military contacts who confirmed the facility's existence, and every ranger who'd encountered these entities. We developed a plan. We couldn't fight these creatures conventionally. We had to heal the forest itself. The operation began on the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Grayson Lake led technical teams to contain the facility's energy leaks. Jordan Martinez organized protective details armed with blessed ammunition and flame weapons. Ian Cross coordinated with Native American spiritual leaders for the cleansing ritual. As night fell, the forest erupted. Every entity seemed to sense what we were attempting. Dogmen howled from multiple directions. Bigfoot families emerged from hiding, not to attack but to observe, and the Wendigo came in force. Carson Reed's team held the perimeter as shamans began their ceremony. The battle was surreal. Modern weapons and ancient magic combined against creatures of legend. I watched a dogman charge through automatic rifle fire, only to recoil from a line of sacred salt. A Wendigo-possessed Bigfoot shrugged off flashbang grenades but fled from burning sage. Axel Thompson documented everything, knowing the world needed to see the truth. His footage showed Jace Williams, a young ranger, standing firm as a Wendigo approached, chanting prayers his grandmother had taught him. The creature's advance slowed, its form flickering as if caught between realities. The turning point came when Dominic Gray's team managed to seal the breach in the containment facility. Using a combination of concrete, lead shielding, and sacred symbols provided by the elders, they cut off the flow of corrupted energy. The effect was immediate. The Wendigo began screaming, their forms becoming less solid. Some collapsed into ash and shadow. Others fled north, their power diminishing with each step. The possessed Bigfoot shuddered and collapsed, the dark influence leaving their bodies. But we'd underestimated the Dogman. As the other threats retreated, the Dogmen pressed their attack. Leonardo Vega realized why. With the Wendigo weakened and the Bigfoot vulnerable, they saw an opportunity to claim territory. "They're not monsters," Leonardo said as we watched them coordinate their assault. "They're predators taking advantage of chaos." The final confrontation was brutal. Bryson White led a desperate defense as waves of Dogmen tried to break through to the ritual site. We lost good people that night, rangers who stood their ground against nightmares to protect something larger than themselves. As dawn broke, the ceremony concluded. The forest felt different, cleaner, lighter. The oppressive atmosphere that had built over months dissipated. The surviving Wendigo had fled to the far north, weakened perhaps permanently. The Bigfoot melted back into the deep woods, traumatized but free. And the Dogmen, faced with unified resistance and the loss of the chaos they'd exploited, retreated to whatever hidden dens they called home. Everett Scott surveyed the aftermath. 7 rangers dead, dozens injured. The facility was sealed permanently, its secrets buried under tons of concrete and sacred earth. Official reports blamed a forest fire for the casualties and a chemical leak for the evacuations. But those of us who were there knew the truth. We'd fought a war against forces beyond normal understanding and somehow prevailed. The forest was safe for now. Parker Hayes transferred out immediately, unable to cope with what he'd seen. Caden Brown took medical leave and never returned. But most of us stayed. Someone had to guard against the darkness, to ensure the balance we'd restored held. 6 months have passed since that night. The forest has returned to relative normalcy. Hikers camp unmolested. Wildlife follows natural patterns. But we remain vigilant, because we know they're still out there. Weston Cole maintains monitoring stations throughout the park, tracking any unusual activity. Jason Mitchell leads monthly patrols to check the sealed facility. Emmett Rodriguez works with tribal elders to maintain protective barriers. The Dogmen have been spotted occasionally, always at distance, always watching. They've learned caution, perhaps respect. The Bigfoot remain hidden, but sometimes leave gifts at ranger stations, carved stones, useful herbs, silent acknowledgments of our shared secret. The Wendigo haven't returned, but sometimes on the coldest nights we hear distant screams from the north. They're weakened, not destroyed. Evil that ancient doesn't die easily. Sawyer Adams asked me why I stay. Why any of us remain after experiencing such horrors. The answer is simple. Someone has to stand guard. Someone has to ensure that what was unleashed never spreads beyond these forests. We are rangers, protectors of both the natural and supernatural world. We've seen monsters and legends, fought battles the public will never know about, and we'll continue watching, waiting, ready for when the darkness tries to return. Because it will return. It always does. In the depths of the American wilderness, ancient powers stir. Creatures from nightmare and legend walk among the trees, and a thin line of men and women stand between them and an unsuspecting world. We are that line. We hold it, no matter what comes howling out of the dark. My name is Deputy Marcus Hale, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the winter of 2013 in Silverton, Colorado. The mountain town sits at 9,300 feet, where the air cuts sharp and the old mining tunnels run deeper than most people care to think about. I've been telling myself for 11 years that I should write this down, get it out of my head somehow. Maybe then the dreams will stop. The Silverton police station squats like a brick toad on Green Street, one story of government-issue architecture that hasn't changed since the 1970s. 2 holding cells, 1 dispatch desk, and a break room that smells permanently of burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. Officer Rodriguez and I had pulled the morning shift that day, coming on at 6 when the mountain shadows still stretched long across the valley floor. Rodriguez was good people. 28 years old, married to a teacher named Carmen, had a baby girl who gurgled when you made faces at her. He'd been talking about maybe applying to the state police, getting out of Silverton before the mine closures killed what was left of the town's economy. I told him he was smart to think ahead. Most of us mountain cops, we get comfortable with the quiet. We forget that quiet can turn deadly faster than a rock slide. The morning started routine enough. A fender bender on Highway 50/50. Some teenagers caught smoking behind the high school. An elderly woman who called because she was sure someone was stealing her newspapers. The kind of calls that make you think police work in a small town is mostly about being a social worker with a badge and a radio. At 7:10 a.m., dispatch crackled to life. Unit 12, we've got a disabled vehicle blocking County Road 11, about 2 miles north of the Mayflower Mill ruins. I clicked the radio. Unit 1, responding. County Road 110 winds through some of the most isolated country in the San Juan Mountains. Abandoned mine shafts dot the landscape like open wounds, most of them unmarked, some of them flooding slowly with groundwater that runs orange with iron oxide. It's the kind of place where you can disappear and not be found until the spring thaw. If then. The vehicle was a Chevy van, probably 20 years old, primer gray with Colorado plates so rusted I could barely make out the numbers. It sat crooked across the narrow dirt road, engine ticking as it cooled. Steam leaked from under the hood in thin white ribbons that dissipated quickly in the mountain air. I pulled up behind it, left my cruiser running, and approached on foot. Standard protocol for a disabled vehicle, though something about the scene felt off. The van's windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see inside, and there were no tracks in the dirt shoulder suggesting the driver had gotten out to check under the hood. I tapped on the driver's window with my knuckle. "Sir, police, are you all right in there?" The window rolled down with a mechanical whine, and I got my first look at the man who would haunt my nights for the next decade. He was maybe 45, pale skin that looked like it hadn't seen much sun. Thin brown hair combed straight back. Nothing particularly memorable about his features except for his eyes, which had a flat, reflective quality that reminded me of creek water over stones. When he smiled, his teeth were the color of old newspaper. "Having some trouble with the engine," he said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Overheated, I think. Don't know much about cars." The smell hit me then. Bleach, sharp and chemical, mixed with something else I couldn't immediately identify. Something organic and wrong. "What's your name, sir?" "Harlan Pike." He fumbled in his jacket pocket and came up empty. "Don't have my license on me. Left it at home." I noticed a small tattoo under his left ear as he turned to look for his wallet. A pig's head, crude black ink like prison work. His right arm bulged strangely, as if he was wearing two shirts, and when he moved I heard something crinkle like plastic. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Pike?" "Delivery," he said, gesturing toward the back of the van. "Had a cooler of meat for a customer up the mountain, but it's starting to spoil in this heat. Probably ruined by now." It was 28 degrees outside. There was no heat to speak of. "Mind if I take a look at what you're hauling?" Something shifted behind his eyes just for a second, but he nodded agreeably enough. "Sure thing, deputy. Though like I said, it's probably spoiled by now." The back doors of the van opened with a squeal of hinges that needed oil. Inside, secured with bungee cords, was a large white cooler, the kind you'd use for a fishing trip or a tailgate party. Except this one was pristine, hospital clean, and there was a biohazard symbol stenciled on the lid in red letters. "What kind of meat did you say this was?" Pike had moved closer, close enough that I could smell the bleach on his clothes more strongly. "Specialty cuts, for a restaurant." I popped the cooler's latches and lifted the lid. The inside was packed with ice and surgical drapes, the kind of sterile blue material you see in operating rooms. Nested among the ice were several clear plastic containers, each about the size of a paperback book, filled with what looked like dark red tissue suspended in clear fluid. "Jesus," I whispered. "Kidneys," Pike said, helpfully. "Human kidneys. Though between you and me, deputy, I don't think that restaurant is going to be serving them to the general public." I reached for my radio, but Pike was already moving. His right hand came up from inside his jacket, and I saw the blade flash in the morning sun. Not a knife exactly, but surgical shears, the kind used to cut through bone. I twisted away from the thrust, but the blade caught the edge of my vest and sliced through the Kevlar like it was tissue paper. Pike was faster than his soft appearance suggested, and stronger. He grabbed my radio hand, twisted until I dropped it, then brought his knee up toward my groin. Training kicked in. I grabbed his wrist, pivoted, and threw him over my hip onto the van's rear bumper. The shears skittered across the gravel, and I went for my sidearm. Pike rolled, came up with a handful of road dirt, and threw it at my face. While I was blinking grit out of my eyes, he bolted for the tray line. I should have pursued him immediately, but something about the cooler and its contents made me hesitate. Those weren't animal organs. The containers were labeled with medical terminology I didn't recognize, but the implications were clear enough. Someone was harvesting human organs, and Pike was the delivery man. I keyed my shoulder radio. "Dispatch, Unit 12. I need backup in an ambulance at County Road 110, mile marker 15. Suspect fled on foot into the woods. Possible homicide investigation." "Copy, Unit 12. Backup is 20 minutes out." 20 minutes in mountain country might as well be 20 hours. Pike could be miles away by then, lost in the maze of abandoned mine shafts and hunting trails that crisscrossed the high country. But as I stood there looking at that cooler full of horrors, I realized that catching Pike might be the least of my problems. Someone was buying what he was selling. Someone with money and connections and the kind of reach that could keep an operation like this running. Someone who wouldn't be happy that their delivery driver had just been compromised. I secured the van as a crime scene and waited for backup, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already being watched from the tree line. Every shadow seemed to move, every branch that rustled in the wind sounded like footsteps. The mountain had gone very quiet, the way it does before a storm. Rodriguez arrived first, his cruiser kicking up a rooster tail of dust as he pulled up behind mine. He took one look at the cooler's contents and went pale under his tan.
Holy shit, Marcus, what the hell did you stumble into?
Nothing good, I said, snapping photos of the van's interior with my digital camera. Guy called himself Harlan Pike. Got away into the woods when I tried to detain him. No ID, no registration, and this van doesn't show up in any database I can access from here. The state police arrived 40 minutes later, followed by a crime scene team from Durango. They cordoned off the area, photographed everything, and loaded the cooler into an evidence van like it contained nuclear material. The lead investigator, a severe woman named Detective Santos, questioned me for 2 hours about every detail of my encounter with Pike. "You're sure about the tattoo?" she asked for the third time. Pig's head under his left ear. Looked like prison ink. She made a note. "We'll run it through the gang database, see if it matches any known symbols. What about the smell you mentioned?" "Bleach, mostly. But something else underneath. Something," I searched for the right word, "rotten." Santos closed her notebook. "We'll have the lab analyze everything. But my guess is you interrupted a very sophisticated organ trafficking operation. The kind that usually has multiple layers of protection." "Meaning?" "Meaning Pike is probably the low man on a very tall totem pole. And the people above him aren't going to be happy that he got burned." She was right, of course. But at the time, I thought the danger had passed. Pike was gone, the evidence was secure, and the state police would handle the investigation from here. I figured I'd write my report, testify at trial if it came to that, and eventually the whole thing would fade into the background noise of police work. I was wrong about that, dead wrong. The first sign that something was seriously amiss came 3 days later. I was working the night shift alone in the station while Rodriguez covered a domestic disturbance call across town. It was past midnight, quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional pop from the aging heating system. I was catching up on paperwork when I heard it, a soft scraping sound from somewhere below the building, like metal against stone, rhythmic and deliberate. I listened for a few minutes, thinking it might be settling pipes or maybe a rodent in the walls, but the sound was too regular, too purposeful. The Silverton station was built in 1974, on what used to be the site of a boarding house for miners. Before that, the lot had been empty land at the edge of one of the larger mine claims. I'd never given much thought to what might be underneath the building. But as I sat there listening to that scraping sound, I started to wonder. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply closet and went outside to check the foundation. The building sat on a concrete slab, standard construction for the era. But as I walked around the perimeter, I noticed something odd. On the north side, where the evidence room backed up against the alley, there was a section of foundation that looked newer than the rest. The concrete was a slightly different color, and the surface was smoother, like it had been poured more recently. The scraping stopped as soon as I stepped outside. I circled the building twice more, but everything was quiet. No tracks in the snow, no signs of disturbance. Just that patch of newer concrete and a growing certainty that something was very wrong. The next morning, I called the town manager's office and asked about building permits and construction records for the station. It took them 3 hours to dig up the files, but what they found was interesting. In 1987, 13 years after the original construction, the town had paid for foundation repairs and utility upgrades to the building. The work had been done by a contractor from Grand Junction who was no longer in business. I requested the original blueprints for the building and compared them to what had actually been built. The evidence room was supposed to be 8 feet by 12 feet. The actual room was only 8 feet by 10 feet. Somewhere in the renovation, 2 feet of space had disappeared. That night I came in early and went straight to the evidence room. It was cramped and windowless, lined with metal shelving that held boxes of case files dating back to the 1980s. The rear wall was standard drywall over framing, painted institutional beige. But when I tapped on it with my knuckle, it sounded hollow. I found a utility knife in the supply closet and carefully cut through the paint along what looked like a seam in the wall. The drywall came away in a neat rectangle, revealing a sheet of plywood underneath. The plywood wasn't attached to the framing. It was held in place by friction and gravity. Behind the plywood was darkness. I shone my flashlight into the gap and saw rough stone walls, old timber supports, and the glint of metal rails disappearing into the black. It was a mine tunnel, just like thousands of others that honeycombed the mountains around Silverton, except this one had been deliberately concealed behind a false wall. The air that drifted out smelled of earth and moisture and something else, something chemical and wrong, like the smell that had clung to Pike's clothes. I should have called for backup, should have contacted the state police and let them handle it. But something about that tunnel called to me, whispered that the answers I needed were waiting in the dark below. I climbed through the opening and dropped down onto the tunnel floor, my boots ringing against old steel rails. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle grade, following what had probably been a vein of silver ore a century ago. Electric cables had been strung along the walls at some point, though most of the light fixtures were dark. I followed the tunnel for maybe 50 yards before it opened into a wider chamber. Here someone had installed more recent improvements. Battery-powered LED strips along the walls, plastic sheeting to keep out moisture, and a heavy steel door set into the far wall. The door was ajar, and light leaked out around the edges. I drew my sidearm and approached carefully. Through the gap I could see what looked like a medical facility. Stainless steel tables, glass-fronted cabinets full of surgical instruments, and a row of chest freezers humming quietly against one wall. The smell was stronger here. Bleach and antiseptic, but underneath it the unmistakable odor of death. I pushed the door open with my foot and stepped inside, gun raised. The room was empty of people, but full of horrors. The freezers contained dozens of organs floating in preservation fluid, each one labeled with medical terminology and what looked like serial numbers. The surgical tables were stained with old blood, and the instruments in the cabinets were arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of frequent use. On a desk in the corner, I found a ledger book filled with entries in multiple handwritings, dates, times, descriptions of inventory, and dollar amounts that made my stomach turn. The most recent entry was dated 2 days ago. 2 kidneys, 1 liver, grade A condition, payment pending delivery. That's when I heard the footsteps in the tunnel behind me. I killed the lights and pressed myself against the wall beside the door, listening. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving carefully but not quietly enough. At least 3 people, maybe more. They were trying to be stealthy, but the tunnel acoustics carried every scrape of boot leather against stone. The voices were low, conversational, professional. Should have been more careful with the deputy. Pike was always sloppy. That's why we keep him on delivery. Containment is the priority now. Clean up the mess. I eased my radio off my belt and keyed it to transmit, but got only static. The mountain and all that rock between me and the surface were blocking the signal. I was on my own, trapped in an underground surgical suite with a team of people who spoke about murder the way most folks discuss the weather. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A bright LED flashlight beam swept across the room and I heard someone curse softly. Lights are off. That's not right. Maybe the generator kicked off again. Check the power panel. I had maybe 30 seconds before they discovered I was there. The room had only one exit, and they were standing in it. But the freezers were large enough to hide behind, and the shadows in the corners were deep enough to conceal a man if he stayed very still. I moved carefully along the wall toward the back of the room, where the largest freezer hummed against the stone. As I passed one of the surgical tables, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Leather restraints attached to the corners, stained dark with old blood. This wasn't just an organ harvesting operation. They were taking people alive. The first man through the door was tall and thin, dressed in hospital scrubs under a heavy coat. He carried a medical bag in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him came Pike, looking more alert and dangerous than he had during our encounter on the mountain road. The third man was young, maybe 25, with the kind of military bearing that suggested special forces training. "Power's fine," Pike said, flipping a switch. The LED strips buzzed back to life. Someone's been here. The tall man in scrubs. A doctor, I realized, seeing the way he moved around the medical equipment. Checked the ledger book on the desk.
Nothing's been taken, but someone definitely disturbed things.
"The deputy," Pike said, "has to be. I told you we should have dealt with him immediately. And I told you that killing a cop brings heat we don't need." The doctor replied, "Better to relocate and start fresh somewhere else." The young man with military bearing spoke for the first time. "Too late for that now. He's seen too much. We have to assume he's already reported it." They moved around the room with practiced efficiency, checking the freezers and gathering instruments into metal cases. These weren't amateurs or opportunists. This was an organized operation with protocols and procedures, the kind of thing that required serious money and serious connections. I stayed hidden behind the freezer, trying to think of a way out. My radio was useless down here, and even if I could get a signal, backup was 20 minutes away under the best circumstances. By the time help arrived, these 3 would be long gone and I'd probably be strapped to one of those tables. The doctor was muttering as he worked 3 years building this up. Perfect location. Now we have to start over because Pike couldn't handle a simple traffic stop. "We've got fallback sites," the young man said. "Colorado Springs, Albuquerque. We can be operational again in a week." "What about the client list?" Pike asked. "Encrypted and backed up. We don't lose anything except time." They were almost finished packing when the doctor stopped and sniffed the air. "Do you smell that?" Pike paused. "Smell what?" "Aftershave. Someone's been here recently. The young man drew his weapon. A compact pistol that looked military issue. Spread out, check every corner. I had maybe 10 seconds before they found me. The freezer I was hiding behind was on wheels, and there was just enough space between it and the wall for a man to squeeze through. I took a deep breath and pushed. The freezer rolled forward 6 inches, just enough to block the narrow aisle between the surgical tables. The young man with the gun came around the left side, while Pike approached from the right. The doctor stayed by the door, blocking my exit. "Police!" I shouted, rising from behind the freezer with my weapon drawn. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." The young man dove behind a table and started shooting. His first round sparked off the freezer's metal surface inches from my head. I returned fire, punching 2 holes through the tabletop where he was hiding. Pike had a knife again, those same surgical shears he'd tried to gut me with on the mountain road. He came at me in a low crouch, using the medical equipment for cover. I put a round into his shoulder that spun him around, but he kept coming. The doctor was shouting into a radio. "Emergency extraction, underground facility compromised, 3 minutes." Pike reached me just as I was swinging my gun toward the young man behind the table. The shears caught the underside of my gun hand, opening a gash from wrist to knuckle. I dropped my weapon and grabbed Pike's wrist with my good hand. We wrestled between the surgical tables, knocking over instrument trays and IV stands. Pike was wiry and desperate, fighting like a man who knew this was his last chance. But he was also bleeding from the shoulder wound, and I was younger and stronger. I got my forearm across his throat and applied pressure. He thrashed for maybe 30 seconds before going limp. The young man had stopped shooting and was moving toward the door. I scrambled for my dropped weapon, but he was already past the doctor and disappearing into the tunnel. The doctor looked at me for a moment, his face calculating, then followed the gunman into the darkness. I heard them running down the tunnel, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. An engine started somewhere in the distance, muffled by rock and earth. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance, they were gone. Pike was unconscious but alive, bleeding slowly from the shoulder wound. I cuffed him with my spare zip ties and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. Then I climbed back up through the evidence room and called for backup, an ambulance, and every available unit in 3 counties. It took the crime scene team 6 hours to process the underground facility. They found enough evidence to support charges against a dozen people, including detailed records of organ sales dating back 3 years. The operation had been supplying black market organs to wealthy clients across the Southwest, using homeless people and undocumented immigrants as unwilling donors. Pike survived surgery and was arraigned on federal charges. He refused to cooperate with investigators, but the records they found in the underground facility told the story. The network included surgeons, organ brokers, and what the FBI described as procurement specialists, people who kidnapped victims and transported them to surgery sites. The doctor and the young gunman were never found. The FBI believed they were part of a larger organization with operations in multiple states, possibly multiple countries. The investigation was ongoing, they said, but I got the impression that the important players had escaped. 3 weeks after the raid on the underground facility, I got a call at home. It was just after midnight, and the voice on the other end was cultured, educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "Deputy Hale, I believe you have something that belongs to me." I sat up in bed, instantly awake. "Who is this?" "Someone who invests considerable time and money in maintaining profitable enterprises. You've caused significant disruption to one of those enterprises. If you're talking about the organ trafficking ring, that operation is shut down. Pike is in federal custody, and the FBI has your records." The man on the phone chuckled softly. "Pike is expendable. The records are replaceable. But you, Deputy Hale, you're a problem that requires a more permanent solution." The line went dead. I called the FBI immediately and reported the threat. They put a watch on my house and assigned an agent to coordinate with local law enforcement. But I knew it was mostly theater. If this organization was as sophisticated as it appeared, they could wait months or years for the right opportunity. I started carrying my weapon off duty and checking my car for bombs before starting the engine. I varied my routes to and from work, never parked in the same place twice, and installed motion sensors around my house. The precautions became second nature after a while, but the paranoia never quite went away. 2 months later, Rodriguez came to me with disturbing news. "We've got a problem," Rodriguez said, sliding a manila folder across my desk. His face was grim, and I could see he'd been losing sleep. Dark circles under his eyes, 3 days of stubble, the kind of look cops get when a case starts eating at them. Inside the folder were crime scene photos from Durango, 60 miles south of Silverton, a homeless camp under the highway overpass. 5 bodies discovered by a road crew that morning. All of them were missing organs. "Medical examiner says the surgical work was professional," Rodriguez continued. Clean incisions, proper technique, organs removed while the victims were still alive. Just like the facility we found under the station, I studied the photos, trying to push down the sick feeling in my stomach. These weren't random killings. Someone was rebuilding the network, establishing new procurement sites and surgery centers. The voice on the phone had been right. Pike was expendable, and shutting down one location had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. FBI know about this? They're en route. But Marcus, there's more. Rodriguez pulled out a second set of photos. 3 similar scenes in the past month. One in Cortez, one outside Pagosa Springs, and one just north of Alamosa. All homeless victims, all professionally harvested. I looked at the map he'd sketched on a yellow legal pad. The locations formed a rough circle around the Four Corners region, with Silverton near the center. Someone was establishing a network of killing sites. Probably mobile units that could be moved quickly if discovered. They're hunting, I said, systematically working their way through the transient population. People who won't be missed, who don't have families filing missing person reports. That's what I think too. But here's what really bothers me. Rodriguez leaned forward, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the station. I've been making calls, talking to other departments in the region. At least 4 cops have reported strange encounters in the past month. Traffic stops that went sideways, suspicious vehicles that disappeared before backup could arrive. One deputy in Cortez swears he was being followed for 3 days. The paranoia I'd been fighting suddenly seemed a lot more reasonable. They're scouting law enforcement response times, learning our patrol patterns, figuring out how long they have to work before we show up. And Marcus? That deputy in Cortez who thought he was being followed? His name is Mike Santos. He's the one who found the homeless camp outside Pagosa Springs. The implication hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just hunting transients anymore. They were hunting cops, specifically cops who had interfered with their operations. Santos had found one of their kill sites, just like I'd found their underground facility. Now he was a target, just like me. I reached for the phone to call the FBI, but Rodriguez stopped me. There's one more thing, he said. Carmen got a call at home yesterday. Man with an accent, asking about her schedule at the school, what time she gets off work, what route she drives home. Carmen was Rodriguez's wife. A kindergarten teacher who wouldn't hurt a fly, who made cookies for the church bake sale and volunteered at the animal shelter. If they were threatening her, it meant the rules had changed completely. You need to get her out of town, I said. Today. Right now. Already done. She's staying with her sister in Denver until this is over. But Marcus, what if it's never over? What if these people just keep coming? It was a question I'd been asking myself every night for 2 months. The organization behind the organ trafficking network had resources and reach that extended far beyond anything we could handle at the local level. Even the FBI seemed to be struggling with the scope of the investigation. Arresting Pike and shutting down one facility had been like stepping on an anthill. It had scattered the insects, but it hadn't destroyed the colony. My phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Colorado area code. Deputy Hale speaking. Hello again, Deputy. The same cultured voice from my midnight call 2 months earlier. I hope you've had time to consider our previous conversation. I gestured for Rodriguez to pick up the extension and start recording. What do you want? Your cooperation. You've proven to be remarkably resourceful, and we have need of someone with your skills. I'm not interested in working for organ thieves and murderers. The man chuckled. Such moral certainty. But tell me, Deputy, how much do you know about your friend Officer Rodriguez's financial situation? I felt the world tilt sideways. Rodriguez was staring at me from across the room, his face pale. His wife's medical bills from last year's cancer treatment, the voice continued. The second mortgage on their house, the credit card debt that's spiraling out of control despite their best efforts. We know everything, Deputy Hale, and we know that Carmen's remission is still very fragile. Rodriguez closed his eyes and sank into his chair. Carmen's cancer had been diagnosed 8 months ago, and the treatment had been brutal and expensive. Even with insurance, the medical bills had nearly bankrupted them. What are you suggesting? I asked. Officer Rodriguez has been very helpful to our organization, whether he realizes it or not. Information about patrol schedules, response times, evidence procedures, nothing that directly compromised any investigations, you understand. Just background information that helped us avoid unnecessary confrontations. I looked at Rodriguez, saw the shame and terror in his eyes. He'd been feeding information to the organ traffickers, probably without fully understanding what he was doing or who he was helping. In exchange, the voice continued, we've been helping with Carmen's medical expenses, anonymous payments to the hospital, mysterious insurance adjustments that reduce their out-of-pocket costs. Nothing traceable, of course. You son of a bitch, I whispered. Now, Deputy, that kind of language isn't productive. Officer Rodriguez has been a valuable asset, but we need someone with your investigative skills and your access to federal information. The FBI's task force is becoming inconvenient for our operations. I'll never help you. Oh, but you will. Because if you don't, Carmen Rodriguez's cancer will return. Perhaps not naturally. These things can be arranged. And there will be tragic accidents. Officer Rodriguez might not survive his next traffic stop. You yourself might discover that your car's brakes have mysteriously failed on a mountain road. The line went dead. Rodriguez was crying now, great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. I'm sorry, Marcus. God, I'm so sorry. They started calling 6 months ago, just asking questions about department procedures, nothing that seemed important. Then Carmen got sick, and the bills started piling up, and they said they could help if I just kept answering questions. I wanted to be angry with him, but I couldn't. These people were professionals at manipulation and coercion. They'd identified his weakness and exploited it with surgical precision, just like they harvested organs from their victims. How much have you told them? Everything, he whispered. Patrol schedules, evidence procedures, when the state police were planning raids. I thought if I could keep Carmen alive, I could find a way to stop helping them later. But there is no later, is there? They own me now. The federal agents arrived an hour later, led by Detective Santos, the same severe woman who had questioned me after Pike's arrest. She listened to Rodriguez's confession without comment, then had him sign a detailed statement admitting to providing information to a criminal organization. We can offer protection, she said, but it will mean entering the witness protection program. New identities, new lives, probably in different states. You'll never be able to contact your families or return to Colorado. What about going after the people who did this? I asked. Santos shook her head. We've been tracking this organization for 3 years. They're international, with cells operating in at least 6 countries. Every time we shut down one operation, 2 more pop up. The best we can do is damage control and protecting the people they've targeted. So they win. They always win. Deputy Hale. People like this, they have resources and patience that law enforcement can't match. The only choice is whether you want to be a victim or a survivor. That night I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of whiskey and my service weapon on the table in front of me. The smart play was obvious. Take the FBI's protection offer, disappear into a new identity, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Let someone else fight the ghosts. But I kept thinking about those photos from the homeless camps, about Carmen Rodriguez's medical bills being paid with blood money, about the voice on the phone that spoke of murder like a business transaction. Sometimes the smart play isn't the right play. I picked up the phone and dialed the number that had called me twice. I want to make a deal, I said when the cultured voice answered. The meeting was set for midnight at the abandoned Mayflower Mill, the same area where I'd first encountered Pike 3 months earlier. I drove there alone against explicit FBI orders, carrying only my service weapon and a wire that Detective Santos had insisted on taping to my chest. This is suicide, she told me during the briefing. These people have killed dozens of victims. What makes you think they'll honor any agreement with you? Because they need something from me, I'd replied. Information about the federal investigation, access to evidence, someone inside law enforcement who can warn them about raids. I'm more valuable to them alive than dead. It was a calculated risk based on my understanding of how the organization operated. They were business people first, killers second. Every murder had been committed to protect their operations or eliminate threats. If I could convince them that I was an asset rather than a liability, I might have a chance. The Mayflower Mill squatted against the mountainside like a technological ghost, its rusted machinery and collapsing buildings testament to Silverton's mining past. During the day, it was a tourist attraction where families took photos and kids climbed on the old equipment. At night, it was a landscape of shadows and decay that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I parked near the main building and waited. The wire in my chest felt like a metal snake coiled against my ribs, and I could hear my own heartbeat amplified in my ears. Every shadow might hide a sniper. Every sound might be the approach of killers. At 12:15, a black SUV materialized from the darkness and parked 50 yards away. 3 figures got out. The doctor from the underground facility, the young gunman, and a woman I hadn't seen before. She was maybe 50, well-dressed in a way that suggested serious money, and she moved with the kind of confidence that comes from being accustomed to power. They approached slowly, hands visible, no obvious weapons. The woman walked slightly ahead of the other 2, marking her as the person in charge. Deputy Hale, she said when they were close enough to talk without shouting. Her voice was the cultured accent from the phone calls. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Let's skip the pleasantries, I said. What do you want from me? She smiled. Expression that didn't reach her eyes. Direct. I appreciate that in a man. Very well. We want information about the federal task force investigating our operations. Specifically, we want to know about planned raids, evidence that's been collected, and the identities of any confidential informants. In exchange for what? Your life, Officer Rodriguez's life, his wife's continued good health, the lives of several other law enforcement officers who have become inconvenient for our organization. She gestured, and the young gunman produced a tablet computer. The screen showed surveillance photos of at least a dozen cops from departments across Colorado and New Mexico. All of them had apparently interfered with the organization's operations in some way. We prefer cooperation to elimination, the woman continued, but we're prepared for either option. I pretended to consider the offer while counting the seconds that had passed since the conversation began. The FBI surveillance team was positioned in the tray line around the mill, but they needed enough recorded evidence to make arrests that would stick in court. How do I know you won't just kill me once you get what you want? Because we're business people, Deputy Hale. We honor our agreements when it's profitable to do so. You provide us with information, we provide you with protection and compensation. Everyone benefits. The doctor stepped forward. We've already demonstrated our commitment to cooperation with Officer Rodriguez. His wife's medical treatments have been quite expensive, but she's receiving the finest care available. Speaking of Rodriguez, I said, where is he? I want to see him before I agree to anything. The woman nodded to the young gunman, who spoke into a radio. A few minutes later, another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. Rodriguez got out of the passenger side, flanked by two men in dark clothing. Even at a distance, I could see that his hands were zip-tied behind his back. He's unharmed, the woman said, and he'll remain that way as long as you cooperate. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Rodriguez was close enough for the FBI snipers to have clear shots at his guards, and all the principal players in the organization were exposed in the open ground around the mill. I keyed the transmitter hidden in my jacket pocket. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Floodlights blazed to life from positions around the mill, turning night into harsh white day. Amplified voices shouted commands. FBI, you're surrounded. Drop your weapons and get on the ground. The woman's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath. You're making a mistake, Deputy. The only mistake I made was taking 3 months to do this. The young gunman was reaching for his weapon when the first sniper's bullet took him in the chest. He dropped without firing a shot. The doctor tried to run and made it maybe 10 yards before a second bullet dropped him face first into the gravel. The woman stood perfectly still, hands raised, as FBI agents converged from all directions. She looked at me with something that might have been respect. This isn't over, she said as they cuffed her. Yes, it is, I replied. But even as I said it, I knew she was probably right. The trials took 18 months. The woman, whose real name turned out to be Dr. Elena Vasquez, was convicted on 47 counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. She received 7 consecutive life sentences and was sent to a federal prison in Colorado where she would die behind bars. The organization's network proved to be even larger than the FBI had suspected. Raids in 6 states and 3 countries netted over 200 arrests, shut down dozens of illegal surgical facilities, and rescued 19 victims who were being held for organ harvesting. Rodriguez served 6 months in federal prison for his cooperation with the traffickers, then entered the witness protection program with Carmen. I got a postcard from him last Christmas, no return address, just a photo of a beach somewhere, and a note saying they were doing well. Pike died in prison before his trial began. Someone stabbed him 17 times in the shower room at the Federal Detention Center in Denver. The killing was never solved, but I suspected that Dr. Vasquez had long reach even from behind bars. I stayed in Silverton another 2 years before accepting a job with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The work is similar, investigating organized crime, human trafficking, cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries, but I travel more now, and I never stay in one place long enough to establish patterns that enemies could exploit. The underground facility beneath the Silverton police station was sealed with concrete after the investigation concluded. The evidence room was rebuilt on the opposite side of the building, and the tunnels were filled with cement to prevent future access. But sometimes, late at night when I'm passing through town on other business, I can still hear the ghosts down there in the darkness. The nightmares have faded mostly. I don't wake up in cold sweats anymore, and I've stopped checking my car for bombs every morning. But I still vary my routes, still carry my weapon off duty. Still look twice at every shadow. Because I learned something important during those months in 2013. Evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare and dramatic gestures. It comes quietly, wearing ordinary faces, speaking in reasonable voices about practical solutions to difficult problems. It offers to help with your medical bills, your mortgage payments, your sick wife's cancer treatments. And once you accept that help, once you compromise just a little bit to protect the people you love, the ghosts have you. They own a piece of your soul, and they'll never let you go. The mountains around Silverton are full of abandoned mines, dark holes in the earth where men once dug for silver and gold. Most of them are empty now, flooded with groundwater or collapsed from decades of neglect. But some of them hide other things: secret facilities, unmarked graves, evidence of crimes that will never be solved. On clear nights when the wind is just right, you can hear voices echoing from those deep places. The ghosts of victims, perhaps, or maybe just the sound of evil being born in the darkness below. I don't go looking for those voices anymore. I've learned to live with the knowledge that some horrors are too big to fight, too well funded and organized to defeat. The best you can do is survive, protect the people you can protect, and hope that someone else will take up the fight when you're gone. But sometimes driving through the mountains on a case, I'll see an abandoned mine shaft or a lonely stretch of highway where a van might stall at just the right moment. And I'll remember that there are still predators out there, still people who speak of murder like a business transaction, still organizations that harvest human beings like cattle. The ghosts are still hungry. And they're still hunting,